You're not supposed to be here." David Kane's words echoed in the frozen air, barely audible over the howling wind. His eyes scanned the barren wasteland of ice and snow, but it wasn't the landscape that held his attention. It was her, Zelara, a towering alien warrior, a survivor left to die in the cold. She lay motionless, her body half buried in snow, her once pristine armor now scorched and torn. Every inch of her radiated a power that was both fierce and tragic. David knew he shouldn't be here. He was just a human, a man with nothing more than basic survival training, thrown into this alien world with no warning. But there she was, and something deep inside told him that if he didn't help her, no one would. He had no idea who she was, what her story was, or why she had been abandoned. But all he could see was a person, a living being in need. His fingers numbed from the cold as he knelt beside her. He hesitated for only a moment, and then gently rolled her over, checking for signs of life. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. His heart clenched. She wasn't just unconscious, she was close to death. With no time to waste, David threw his survival pack off his back and quickly fished out what he could. He had medical supplies, but they were only enough to stabilize her for a short time. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, pulling her closer and starting to bandage her wounds as best he could. "You're not dying here, not like this." He lifted her with surprising strength, carrying her with his arms wrapped around her torso. She was heavy, far heavier than a human should be, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The wind whipped at his face, stinging him with its icy touch, but he kept moving, his only focus on getting her to shelter. The storm was unforgiving. It whipped around him, each gust colder than the last, but he refused to let go. He couldn't let this alien die in the cold. "Hold on," he grunted through clenched teeth. He knew nothing about her species. The tales about her kind, the ruthless warriors, the cold-blooded conquerors, swirled in his mind. But in that moment, none of it mattered. She was just someone in need, someone he could help. After what felt like an eternity, he finally found cover. A small cave, sheltered from the worst of the wind. He gently laid her down on the ground, his body trembling from exhaustion and cold. He quickly set up a heat source, watching her carefully. Her breathing had become more regular, but she was still unconscious, still vulnerable. As he sat beside her, watching over her, he couldn't shake the nagging question that had been in his mind since he'd first seen her. Why had she been abandoned? What had led to this moment? But even more pressing, why had he chosen to help her? It was dangerous, foolish even. He wasn't some hero. But as he watched her chest rise and fall, David knew one thing for sure. He had done the right thing. And somehow, he felt that this moment, this act of kindness, would change everything. But for now, he stayed silent, waiting. Waiting for her to wake, waiting for the answers. Waiting for the moment that would redefine everything he knew about what it meant to be human. David stayed by Zelara's side through the long hours of the night, watching her steady breaths as the storm outside raged on. He had no idea how much time had passed, but it felt like the world had slowed to a crawl. His hands were still sore from carrying her, but the pain didn't matter. She was alive, and that was all that counted. The warmth from the small fire he had started began to fill the cave, slowly thawing the chill from his bones. As he glanced down at her, something stirred within him. He had never been one to get involved in the affairs of others, especially not alien races. But something about this situation, about her, felt different. She wasn't just some warrior from another world. She was a person, struggling, just like him. The thought of leaving her here, alone to freeze, had never crossed his mind. He had acted without thinking, without hesitation, and now she was here, in his care. A low groan broke the silence. David's head snapped up, his heart racing. He leaned forward, watching as Zelara's eyes fluttered open. The confusion in her gaze was unmistakable. For a moment, she looked at him as if he were a stranger, then her eyes narrowed. "Where am I?" Her voice was rough, but still strong. "You're safe," David replied, trying to sound reassuring. "You're in a cave. The storm outside, it's too dangerous. You were unconscious. I brought you here." Zelara blinked, as if processing his words. "You saved me." There was disbelief in her tone, but David could see something else there, a flicker of vulnerability. "Yes," he said simply. "You were about to die out there. I couldn't leave you." She remained silent for a moment, her gaze drifting away as if she were trying to make sense of everything. "I don't need your help," she said finally, her voice tinged with pride. David wasn't surprised. He had heard about the pride of alien warriors, their refusal to accept help from anyone, let alone a human. But he could see that she was weak, vulnerable in a way she wasn't used to. "I didn't do it for you," he said, his voice steady. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Zelara turned her head slowly to meet his gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't just the cold that filled the air. There was something else, something unspoken, between them. She was an alien, a being from a world far away. He was a human, just a man with his own struggles. But in that moment, they were connected, not by their differences, but by the simple act of survival. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "I thought humans were weak." David smiled, the corners of his lips curling slightly. "You'll learn we're not as weak as you think." She didn't respond right away, but David could see her thinking. The tension between them was palpable, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like the beginning of something else, something new. The fire crackled softly as the storm outside continued to howl, but in the cave, there was a quiet calm, a moment of peace amidst the chaos. Zelara looked down at her hands, her mind racing, but David's presence was a strange comfort, a reminder that not all hope was lost. As they sat in silence, the weight of their shared experience began to settle between them. There were no words for what was happening, no easy explanations. But in the cold, in the isolation of that cave, they both knew that something had changed. Something had begun. The fire in the cave crackled softly, the only sound breaking the heavy silence between them. Zelara, her back resting against the cold stone, still seemed distant, lost in her thoughts. David sat nearby, his hands pressed together, his eyes on the flames. They had been here for hours, but the tension between them had only grown. The storm outside raged on, but it was the storm inside the cave that David couldn't ignore. She was still a stranger, an alien, someone from a world he knew nothing about. Yet, she had started to shift in his mind, from a faceless warrior to someone with a story, with a past. Zelara's voice broke the silence again, softer this time, almost hesitant. "I don't know why I'm still here." David turned toward her, surprised. "What do you mean?" She didn't meet his eyes, instead staring at her hands, her fingers curling into a fist before loosening again. "I don't belong here. I don't belong with you." David felt the weight of her words, though he didn't fully understand. "I didn't bring you here to be a burden," he said. "You're not a burden." Her gaze finally lifted, and she met his eyes with something that could almost be described as vulnerability. "I'm supposed to be strong, a warrior, a leader, but I feel like I've failed." David's chest tightened at the rawness in her voice. She wasn't just physically wounded. She was broken in ways he hadn't expected. "No one's perfect," he said, his voice steady. "Not even warriors." Zelara's lips twisted into a faint, almost sad smile. "You don't know what it's like to be hunted, to be the last of your people, to be forced to fight every day just to survive." There was a sorrow in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, a deep, aching loneliness. "I know what it's like to fight," David said quietly. "Not for my life, but for others, for the people I care about." She seemed to consider this, her eyes softening for a moment before hardening again. "I'm not like you," she said, almost challenging him. "I was taught to be ruthless, to never show weakness. But here I am, wounded, alone, and you saved me." David shifted uncomfortably, his thoughts a mix of confusion and empathy. "I don't see what you're seeing," he said slowly. "I just did what anyone would do in my place. You're still breathing. That's what matters." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, but in the cave, there was a quiet stillness, a sense that something was shifting between them. Zelara finally spoke, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. Maybe I don't have to be alone anymore." David's heart skipped a beat at her words, but he didn't know how to respond. "You're not alone," he said, though it felt like the simplest of answers, not nearly enough. She glanced at him, her gaze uncertain. "I've spent my entire life fighting, trusting no one. But you didn't leave me out there to die." She took a deep breath, looking down at her hands again. "I don't know what to do with this feeling." David stood up slowly, his muscles aching from the cold and the long hours of sitting. You don't have to know, he said. Just take it one step at a time. Zelara looked up at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken. Thank you, David. Her voice was quieter now, more sincere. He nodded, though words seemed insufficient. You don't need to thank me. For the first time in what felt like forever, Zelara let her guard down, just a little, and David realized that in the vastness of space, amidst the dangers of alien worlds and wars, the most human thing he could do was offer kindness. And in that moment, it was enough. The fire burned brightly between them, the storm outside still fierce, but inside the cave, there was something new, something fragile, but real. The next morning, the storm had finally begun to die down, leaving a cold stillness in the air. David awoke to the sound of Zelara shifting beside him. He turned his head, still groggy from a restless night, but the sight of her sitting up caught him off guard. She was leaning against the cave wall, her violet skin still pale from the cold, but her eyes were alert, watching the horizon through the narrow gap in the cave entrance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. David rubbed his face with a tired hand, the weight of the past few hours settling on his shoulders. He had never imagined that a simple act of kindness would lead to this moment, a moment where he felt a strange bond forming between them. Zelara glanced at him, her voice low and rough. You didn't have to save me, she said, her tone tinged with the faintest hint of gratitude. I could have survived on my own. David looked at her, unsure of how to respond. Maybe, he said slowly, but I didn't want to take the chance. No one deserves to die out there. Zelara studied him for a moment, then turned her gaze back to the cave entrance, her eyes narrowing slightly. I've been alone for so long, David. I fought alone, trusted no one. Her voice wavered, the wall she had built around herself starting to crack. It's hard to let go of that. David's heart softened at her words. He had never been in a war, never faced the kind of isolation she had known, but he understood loneliness. He had felt it too, in his own way. I get it, he said quietly. But you don't have to be alone anymore. Not here. Not with me. The words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over them both. Zelara turned to look at him again, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. Why? Why are you doing this for me? David looked down at the ground, unsure how to explain it. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe it's because I can. Maybe it's because you're not just a warrior or an alien. You're a person, a living being who deserves something better than to die alone in the cold. Zelara seemed to consider this, her eyes still searching his face. For the first time, David saw the walls completely come down, replaced by something raw, something vulnerable. Thank you, she whispered. David nodded, feeling the depth of her words in his chest. He wasn't a hero, wasn't looking for any kind of reward, but hearing her say those two words made it all feel worth it. You don't need to thank me, he said gently. Just don't forget that you're not alone. You have a choice now. We both do. Zelara's lips twitched at the corners, a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Maybe, she said softly, her voice distant, as if unsure of what she was saying. Maybe I'll start believing that. They both sat in silence, watching the fire as it flickered and crackled in front of them. For the first time in a long time, the future felt uncertain, but it wasn't filled with the same kind of hopelessness that had defined Zelara's life for so long. With David at her side, for the first time, she had a chance at something new. A chance at peace. At hope. David wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he was making a difference. Not just for her, but for both of them. As the days passed, the cave slowly transformed from a place of survival to a place of refuge. The fire burned brightly each night, its warmth a constant reminder that they were no longer at the mercy of the storm outside. David and Zelara spent their time in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, yet somehow, a shared understanding had begun to form between them. There were no more words of doubt or uncertainty. Zelara had learned to trust him, and in return, David had learned to see beyond the alien warrior she appeared to be. One morning, as the sun finally peeked through the thinning clouds, Zelara stood by the entrance of the cave, her posture tall and proud, the wind tousling her silver-white hair. David, watching her from across the room, couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. She looked different now, not just in the way her eyes softened when she spoke to him, but in the way she stood. She wasn't the same warrior who had been left to die in the snow. She was someone who had been given a second chance, someone who had seen kindness for the first time in a long while. "You're thinking about leaving," David said quietly, stepping closer to her. He could tell she was ready. The storm had passed, the danger had subsided. But there was something in her eyes, something that told him she was unsure. "I don't belong here," she replied, her voice firm but not as cold as it had been. "I can't stay in a place that reminds me of weakness." David walked up to her, standing just a few feet away. "You don't have to prove anything to me, or anyone." Zelara turned to face him, the distant look in her eyes fading slightly. "You've shown me kindness, David. Something I never thought I'd experience. But I'm not the person I was before. I have to find my own path now." Her words were heavy, the weight of them pressing down on both of them. David understood. She was right. She couldn't stay in the cave forever, hiding from the world that had once been her battlefield. "I get it," he said, his voice steady. "You have to go. But if you ever need help, if you ever find yourself lost again, you know where to find me." Zelara didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then, she nodded slowly, a gesture of understanding, and for the first time, she allowed herself to show the faintest hint of a smile. "Thank you, David," she said quietly. "I never thought I'd meet someone like you. Someone who would care." David smiled back, though his heart felt heavy. He had known this moment was coming. But that didn't make it any easier. "Just promise me something," he said, his voice low. "Promise me you won't forget what you've learned here. That you don't have to fight alone." Zelara took a deep breath, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "I won't forget," she said softly, almost as if she was speaking to herself. She turned to face the open world outside, her figure silhouetted against the brightening sky. It was time to leave. But for the first time, David felt at peace with that. Zelara was ready to face the world again, not as a warrior fighting to survive, but as someone who knew she wasn't alone. He watched as she stepped outside, her figure blending with the landscape, and he knew that, somehow, she would be okay. She was strong, not just in battle, but in the choices she had made, and in the path she had chosen for herself. As the wind picked up again, David stood in the cave, watching the last traces of the storm fade away. He knew that, no matter what happened, their paths had crossed for a reason, and that, in itself, was enough. Days passed, and the memory of Zelara's departure still lingered in David's mind. The cave, once a place of refuge, now felt empty. The storm had long since passed, but there was a stillness in the air that made him feel as if something was missing. He had spent years alone before meeting her, but that solitude had never felt as heavy as it did now. He often found himself looking toward the horizon, as if expecting her to return, but each day ended the same way, with only the wind and the quiet echo of his own thoughts. Then, one afternoon, as David was gathering firewood near the cave, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. His heart skipped a beat as he turned, half expecting to see Zelara standing there, as if nothing had changed. But when he looked, it wasn't her. A group of travelers, humanoid figures cloaked in layers of worn fabric to protect them from the cold, emerged from the shadows of the distant mountains. Their eyes scanned the area, wary and cautious. David instinctively reached for his pack, his fingers brushing the hilt of his knife, though he had no intention of using it. He wasn't the type to fight unless absolutely necessary. One of the travelers, a woman with long, braided hair, noticed him first. She stepped forward, raising a hand in greeting. "We come in peace," she said, her voice strong yet measured. "We've been following the storm's path. We seek shelter." David hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure if he should trust them, but the look in the woman's eyes told him that she wasn't here to harm him. "You're welcome to stay," he said, lowering his hand and taking a step back to allow them space. "There's a cave not far from here. It's warm and safe." As they made their way to the cave, David couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. These strangers weren't just travelers, they were survivors, much like him. They didn't carry weapons openly, but their movements were practiced, efficient. It reminded him of the way Zelara had moved when she had first arrived. He caught himself wondering where she was now, what she was doing. The thought lingered in his mind, but he pushed it aside. The woman who had spoken earlier introduced herself as Isla. She and her group had been traveling for weeks, making their way across the icy landscapes in search of a new home. As they sat around the fire that David had started, the travelers shared their stories. They spoke of their struggles, of the many hardships they had endured, but there was a sense of hope in their words. David found himself listening intently, captivated by their resilience. There was something about their spirit that reminded him of Zelara. It was then that Isla spoke of something that caught his attention. "You're not the only one who survived the storm," she said, her eyes flickering toward him. "There's a warrior, an alien woman. She passed through here a few days ago. I think she might be the one you're looking for." David's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward. "Where did she go?" Isla hesitated, then nodded toward the horizon. "She was heading south." She didn't say much, but there was a look in her eyes, a kind of determination. "She's fighting for something, just like you." David's heart raced. For a moment, he was at a loss for words. Zelara was alive. She had made it through the storm. And now, she was out there, somewhere, fighting for something bigger than herself. The realization hit him hard. He wasn't alone. She wasn't alone. They were both still part of a larger story, one that was still unfolding. The travelers continued to speak, but David was no longer listening. His mind was already on the move, the fire of determination reigniting within him. He would find her. He would find Zelara, and together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. No more running. No more hiding. They were both fighters now, and whatever path lay before them, they would walk it together. David had spent the better part of the day preparing for the journey ahead. His pack was filled with supplies, the firewood was stacked in the corner of the cave, and the travelers had moved on, continuing their trek south. But David's mind was elsewhere, focused entirely on the promise he'd made to himself, to find Zelara. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden light over the frozen landscape, but David felt no warmth from it. The cold had settled deep into his bones, but it was not the weather that made him shiver. It was the thought of Zelara out there, somewhere, alone. He had no idea what kind of dangers she faced, but the thought of her struggling, fighting on her own, made his heart ache. As he tightened the straps of his pack, he heard the crunch of footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, expecting to see one of the travelers who had stayed behind, but instead, it was Isla. She was alone, her face serious, her gaze steady. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with concern. David nodded, not bothering to hide the determination in his eyes. "I have to. She's out there, and I won't stop until I find her." Isla studied him for a moment, then stepped closer. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. "We've survived together. We can help." David shook his head. "This isn't your fight, Isla. It's mine. I can't drag you into this." But Isla was insistent. "You don't have to drag us in, David. We're not helpless, and we've seen what she can do. She's not just a warrior. She's a survivor. If you're determined to find her, we can help you." David hesitated, torn between the need to follow through on his promise to Zelara and the realization that he wasn't truly alone. He could feel the weight of her words, the quiet strength she offered. "I don't know what you're asking for," he said quietly. "But if you're willing to help, I won't turn you away." Isla smiled, a small but genuine expression. "We'll help you find her. Together." David felt a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in days, he wasn't burdened by the weight of loneliness. Isla had given him something he hadn't known he needed. Hope, not just for Zelara's survival, but for his own. They set out that evening, the cold night air biting at their skin, but David's resolve was stronger than ever. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, he didn't feel the crushing weight of isolation. Isla's presence was a steady reassurance. She wasn't just a companion on this journey. She was proof that there was still good in this world, still people who cared. As they traveled south, the landscape began to change. The icy plains gave way to rocky hills, the snow becoming less dense, but still treacherous. David kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning the landscape for any sign of Zelara, but the vastness of the land made it seem like an impossible task. He had no way of knowing where she was, or how much time had passed since the travelers had last seen her. But he wouldn't give up. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. As they pushed forward, Isla kept pace beside him, her breath visible in the cold air. "What do you think she's fighting for?" she asked after a while, her voice quiet. David paused, considering the question. I don't know, he admitted. But I think she's fighting for herself. For the chance to be something more than what she's been. Something more than just a warrior. Isla nodded thoughtfully. I hope you're right. She sounds like someone worth fighting for. David didn't respond right away. He couldn't quite put into words what he was feeling, but he knew this. Zelara had changed him. In a world filled with uncertainty and loss, she had given him something he hadn't realized he'd been missing, a purpose. And now, he would do whatever it took to find her, to make sure she didn't have to fight alone anymore. Days turned into weeks as David, Isla, and the small group of travelers made their way south. The terrain grew more difficult with each passing day. The wind howled, but they kept moving forward, driven by a shared sense of purpose. The thought of Zelara never left David's mind, though he kept his doubts at bay. He had promised to find her, and he would not stop until he did. The weather grew milder, but the constant chill remained, a reminder of the harshness they were all facing. As they trekked deeper into the unfamiliar landscape, the group began to see signs of the world that lay beyond the storm. The remnants of a once thriving settlement, abandoned long ago, lay scattered across the rocky plains. Broken buildings, rusted equipment, and the silent remains of a life that had been lost to time. David found himself wondering about the people who had once lived here, wondering if they had fought the same battles as Zelara. The questions lingered in his mind, but he had little time for them. Zelara was still out there, somewhere. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting an orange glow over the barren landscape, Isla pulled David aside. We need to talk, she said, her tone more serious than he had ever heard it before. David nodded and followed her to a quieter spot away from the others. What's going on? He asked. Isla hesitated for a moment, looking out across the landscape. I've been thinking, she began slowly, about Zelara, about what she might be facing out there. David's chest tightened, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. I don't think she's just running from something. I think she's running towards something. She's been through too much, and I don't believe she's just surviving anymore. I think she's fighting for something bigger. David absorbed her words, feeling the weight of them. You think she's found a cause? Isla nodded. Yes, a reason to keep going. I don't know what it is, but I think she's changed. Maybe she's not the same person you remember. Maybe she's become something more. David's mind raced. Could she be right? Could Zelara have found a new purpose? So what do we do? He asked, his voice steady. We keep searching, Isla said. But we do it with the understanding that when we find her, she might not be the same person we thought we were looking for. She might not need us in the same way. The realization hit David hard. He had always imagined that when they found Zelara, it would be a reunion, a moment of relief. But now, Isla had opened his eyes to a different possibility. Zelara could be different now. She might have changed, just as he had. I don't know what to expect anymore, David said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. But I have to find her. I have to know if she's okay. Isla placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You will, and we'll be with you every step of the way. As they stood there, the wind beginning to pick up once again, David felt the weight of their journey settling in. There was no turning back now. He didn't know what awaited them at the end of the trail, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stop. Not until he found Zelara. Not until he knew she was safe, no matter how much she had changed. With renewed determination, David turned back toward the others, ready to continue the search. The path ahead was uncertain, but his resolve had never been clearer. Zelara was out there, and no matter what it took, he would find her. The journey had been long and tiring, but David and Isla pressed on. The days were filled with the harsh cold of the world around them, but they kept moving, driven by a single, unrelenting goal, to find Zelara. The group had encountered more remnants of abandoned settlements as they moved further south. Each one was a reminder of the world that had once been, of lives lived and lost, but it was a reminder David could barely hold on to. His mind was too focused on what lay ahead, on the hope of finding Zelara. As the sun began to set one evening, casting long shadows across the snow, David felt the familiar weight of uncertainty creeping back into his chest. The path they had been following was becoming less clear, and the cold was starting to take its toll on the group. Isla had noticed his increasing silence and approached him, her footsteps crunching softly in the snow. We're close, aren't we? She asked, her voice quiet but full of understanding. David nodded, though his heart felt heavy. I think so, he said, though he didn't sound entirely sure. They had been tracking Zelara for weeks now, following what little clues they had. There was still no sign of her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were close. Isla studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. You've been pushing yourself, David. We've all been pushing ourselves. But we can't keep going like this without taking a break. David looked at her, his face a mask of determination. I can't stop, he said quietly. Not until I find her. Isla's eyes softened. You're not alone in this, you know. We're all in this together. Don't forget that. For a moment, David didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to say. His thoughts were scattered, his mind racing with the uncertainty of it all. But Isla was right. He wasn't alone. The group, though small, had become something more than just companions on a journey. They had become a family, bound together by their shared purpose. I know, he said finally, his voice low. But I can't stop now. I have to know she's okay. Isla didn't argue. She simply nodded and placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. They both stood there for a moment, staring out into the distance, the quiet of the evening settling around them. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding. They both knew the weight of the journey they had chosen. The next morning, they continued their trek, and though David's pace was slower than before, he could feel the strength of the group behind him. It wasn't just about finding Zelara anymore. It was about surviving together, making sure no one was left behind. As the days passed, the landscape began to shift once again. The ground beneath their feet grew softer, less harsh, and they knew they were getting closer. But the closer they got, the more David felt that nagging doubt creeping into his mind. What if they didn't find her? What if she was gone, lost forever in this unforgiving world? The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't let it consume him. He had to believe that Zelara was still out there, still fighting, still surviving. And then, one evening, as they made camp near the base of a mountain range, David saw something in the distance, something familiar. A silhouette, barely visible against the fading light. It was small, almost hidden, but it was unmistakable. David's heart leaped into his throat. He squinted against the darkening sky, his breath catching. It couldn't be, but it was. There, in the distance, was Zelara. She was standing, her back to them, her figure outlined by the setting sun. The moment stretched on, the silence thick with disbelief and hope. David didn't wait. Without a word, he took off running, his legs burning with the sudden burst of energy. He didn't care if it was too dangerous, if he was being reckless. All that mattered was that she was there. Zelara was alive. As he approached, she turned slowly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, David saw her eyes meet his. There was no anger, no hesitation in her gaze. Just a quiet recognition, a knowing look that said everything. David slowed to a stop in front of her, out of breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Zelara, he whispered, almost in disbelief. She stood there, her expression unreadable, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she nodded. I knew you would come, she said, her voice steady but soft. I knew you wouldn't stop looking for me. David swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. She hadn't given up on herself, and now, she was here. I couldn't leave you out there, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I promised you I wouldn't let you fight alone. She stepped closer, her presence like a quiet storm, and for the first time in a long while, David felt a sense of peace wash over him. They had found each other, and no matter what came next, they would face it together. David stood there, breathless, as he looked into Zelara's eyes. The wind whispered through the mountains around them, but the world felt still, frozen in time. It had taken so long to get here, so many steps, so much uncertainty, and yet here she was, alive, standing in front of him. He had promised her he wouldn't let her fight alone, and now that promise was fulfilled, but it didn't feel like the end. It felt like a beginning, a moment of reunion, but also one of understanding. Zelara was different now. He could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just the warrior who had been left to die in the storm. She was someone who had found a new purpose, and David wasn't sure if that purpose would include him. He didn't know what her journey had been, or where it would lead, but in that moment, he knew that he couldn't leave her again. I thought I lost you, David said softly, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. Zelara regarded him silently for a long moment, the firelight reflecting off her violet skin. You almost did, she said quietly. But you came. I didn't expect that. There was no bitterness in her voice, no resentment, just quiet acceptance. I never stopped looking, David replied. I made a promise. I wasn't about to break it. Zelara's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, David saw a flicker of vulnerability in her, something raw, something human. It wasn't the fierce warrior he had seen when they first met, but a woman who had carried the weight of everything on her shoulders for too long. I couldn't let you face this alone either, she said, her voice steady, yet there was a trace of uncertainty beneath the surface. I thought I could. I thought I could carry the burden on my own. But now, maybe I don't have to. David stepped forward, his hand reaching out, a silent offer. She looked at it for a moment before taking it, her grip firm but warm. I'm not the same person you found in the storm, she said, her voice tinged with quiet strength. But I'm here, and I'll face whatever comes next. David nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and something else, something deeper. We'll face it together, he said, his voice steady. They stood there, for a long while, neither speaking, but both knowing that this was not the end of their journey. It was a new chapter. There would be challenges ahead, that much was certain, but they would face them together. No longer alone. David didn't know what the future would bring, but with Zelara by his side, he felt ready to take it on. The fire crackled softly in the distance, casting a warm glow over the two of them. As they turned to continue their journey, David realized that this was the first time in a long time that he wasn't afraid. Not because the world had suddenly become less dangerous, but because he wasn't carrying the weight of it alone anymore. And for the first time in his life, that felt like enough. The following days were a blur of motion, the group traveling further into the heart of the unknown. The landscape had become even more barren, the mountains looming like silent sentinels above them. Yet, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. Zelara was by his side, no longer just a warrior from another world, but someone who had become part of his journey, part of his life. They walked in comfortable silence, the distance between them no longer filled with uncertainty. It was clear now that they both shared a deeper understanding of the world around them, a bond forged through hardship and survival. But as they approached the base of a towering cliff, something in the air changed. The quiet, peaceful atmosphere of the past few days began to shift, and David's instincts flared. He stopped in his tracks, his eyes scanning the horizon. Zelara, sensing his hesitation, stopped as well. What is it? She asked, her voice low, yet strong. David's gaze remained fixed on the distance, his senses heightened. I don't know, but something feels off, he said, his tone tight. The air was still, too still. The wind had stopped, the sounds of the wilderness silenced as if holding its breath. Then, just as suddenly as the tension had risen, a low rumble echoed from deep within the mountains. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and David felt a sharp jolt of fear pierce his chest. Move, he said urgently, grabbing Zelara's arm. Now. They sprinted toward a narrow pass between two jagged rocks, their footsteps pounding against the ground. The rumble grew louder, closer. David had no idea what was happening, but he couldn't risk waiting to find out. Behind them, the mountains began to shake, sending rocks tumbling down in a cascading roar. Zelara's expression was unreadable, her focus entirely on the path ahead, but David could see the way her posture tensed as she pushed herself to run faster. They reached the narrow pass just as the ground shook again, a violent tremor that nearly threw them off balance. With no time to waste, they ducked into the shadow of the cliffs, hidden from view. Panting, David pressed his back against the cold stone, his heart racing. What the hell was that? He muttered, his voice breathless. Zelara was still for a moment, her eyes narrowed as she looked around. I don't know, but we need to be ready. The rumble had stopped, but the air still felt charged, heavy with the unknown. David wanted to ask more questions, to try and understand what was going on, but instinct told him to stay quiet. Whatever had caused that tremor wasn't something they could face head-on. For now, survival was all that mattered. Zelara's gaze shifted upward, her eyes scanning the cliffs above them. We can't stay here, she said, her voice firm. We have to keep moving. If something's out there, we need to find shelter before it's too late. David nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for his pack. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. Let's go, he said, his voice steady. Together, They moved swiftly through the narrow pass, their movements synchronized in the way only two people who had learned to rely on each other could manage. The rest of the group was still ahead, but David and Zelara moved in perfect unity, their steps echoing in the silence that had settled over the land. The tension was palpable, and David could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Every nerve in his body was on edge. They had come too far to be caught unaware now. With each step, the feeling of dread grew, a gnawing sensation in his stomach that told him they were heading straight into something they might not be able to outrun. But they had no choice. The mountains loomed ahead, their towering peaks a silent reminder of the challenges still to come. No matter what dangers lay ahead, David knew one thing for certain. He would face them with Zelara by his side. And together, they would find a way through. The landscape grew even more desolate as David and Zelara pressed forward, the air heavy with an oppressive silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. The mountains towered over them, jagged and unforgiving, their peaks lost in the mist. Every step they took was measured, calculated. They had no idea what awaited them, but there was no turning back. They had come too far, and David wasn't about to stop now. The tremor from earlier had left them uneasy, but they couldn't afford to dwell on it. Zelara, ever the strategist, had kept her focus. She knew that the key to survival was not in panic, but in maintaining control. "We need to find higher ground," she said, her voice steady but low, as if she were calculating every word. David nodded, sensing the same urgency. They needed a vantage point, somewhere they could get a clearer view of what was ahead. The path they had been following led to a narrow ridge, and as they climbed, the air grew thinner, colder. The wind howled around them, but the sound of it was strangely calming, a constant reminder that they were still alive, still moving forward. They reached the top of the ridge just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley below. For a moment, David stood still, his eyes scanning the landscape. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, something, anything, that would give him a sense of direction. And then he saw it. A faint smoke rising in the distance, barely visible against the pale sky. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Zelara followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing. "That's where we need to go," she said, already starting down the ridge. David didn't hesitate. The smoke was a sign. It was something they could follow, something that could lead them closer to their goal. They made their way toward it, the rough terrain making every step a challenge, but neither of them faltered. As they neared the source of the smoke, the air seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. They had been moving for hours, and fatigue was starting to set in, but David could feel the adrenaline pushing him forward. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. They reached the clearing where the smoke was rising, and what they found was unexpected. A small settlement, nestled against the base of the mountain, a handful of simple structures surrounded by what looked like makeshift defenses. It wasn't much, but it was a place that could offer answers. David and Zelara approached cautiously, their eyes alert for any signs of danger. The settlement was quiet, the kind of quiet that made David uneasy. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, every nerve in his body was telling him something wasn't right. They reached the edge of the settlement, and Zelara stopped, her gaze scanning the area. "Something's off," she muttered, her tone low. David's hand instinctively went to his pack, checking for his knife. "We need to move carefully," he said, his voice steady. They crept closer, moving in the shadows, until they reached the nearest structure. From the outside, it looked abandoned, the door slightly ajar. Zelara pushed it open gently, her eyes flicking around the room. It was empty, save for a few scattered belongings. But something about it felt wrong. The air was thick with the scent of something old, something forgotten. David's heart raced. They were not alone. As they stepped further inside, a noise echoed from the back of the structure. It was faint, but enough to make David freeze in place. Zelara's eyes locked with his, and for a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. They weren't alone, and whatever was in this place, it wasn't friendly. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before a figure stepped out from the shadows. David's grip on. His knife tightened, but he didn't make a move. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and wore a hood that obscured most of their face. "Who are you?" the figure asked, their voice cold and harsh. Zelara stepped forward, her stance defensive. "We're not here to cause trouble. "We're looking for someone," she said, her voice steady but with an edge of authority. The figure tilted their head slightly, studying them both. "Looking for someone? And who might that be?" David didn't speak. His mind raced, but his body was still. The figure wasn't giving anything away, and he wasn't about to make the first move. Zelara stood her ground, her eyes never leaving the figure. "We're looking for a warrior," she said slowly. "A woman. She passed through here recently." The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they stepped back into the shadows, their form blending with the darkness. "You're looking for her," the figure said, their voice now almost a whisper. "But be careful. Not all who wander these lands are who they seem." With that, the figure vanished into the shadows, leaving David and Zelara alone once again. The air felt heavier than before, the uncertainty of what lay ahead now even more apparent. But David knew one thing for certain. They had to find the answers. And they would, no matter the cost. David stood in the shadows, the figure's words echoing in his mind. Not all who wander these lands are who they seem. The warning hung in the air, heavier than the oppressive silence that followed. Zelara's eyes never left the spot where the figure had disappeared. She was tense, every muscle coiled, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. David could feel her unease, and it mirrored his own. They had been through so much to get here, to this place that felt like a trap, but they couldn't turn back now. The journey had led them to this moment, and they would face whatever came next together. Zelara broke the silence first, her voice low but firm. "We need to find out who that was, and what they meant by those words." David nodded, his heart still pounding from the sudden appearance of the mysterious figure. He didn't know who they were, or what their intentions were, but they had a strange sense of foreboding about them. "We have no choice but to keep moving forward," David said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Zelara nodded in agreement, and without another word, they left the room. They moved cautiously through the settlement, keeping to the shadows, the eerie stillness of the place pressing down on them. There were no sounds of life, no signs of movement. It was as if the entire place was abandoned, forgotten by time. But David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every corner they turned, every step they took, he felt eyes on them. It was a feeling that grew stronger with each passing minute. They finally reached the edge of the settlement, where the rocky terrain began to rise again, and the shadows of the mountains loomed ahead. David paused, looking back at the empty structures one last time. "We need to find shelter before nightfall," he said, his eyes scanning the area. "Agreed," Zelara replied, her gaze sharp as ever. She wasn't just a warrior. She had become someone he could rely on, someone who could sense danger even before it arrived. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath them. The mountains ahead seemed to be calling them, their towering peaks shrouded in mist. The closer they got, the more the air seemed to thicken, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. Zelara kept a steady pace, never looking back, always moving forward. But David could tell that she was thinking, her mind working through the possibilities, the dangers that lay ahead. They came to a narrow passageway between two large rocks, and as they passed through it, a gust of wind blew through the gap, sending a chill through David's spine. "This way," Zelara said, pointing toward a small cave entrance further ahead. They made their way to it, their eyes constantly scanning for any sign of movement. As they entered the cave, the cold air from the outside was replaced by the damp, cool air of the cave's interior. It was dark, but there was a faint glow from the moss that clung to the walls. Zelara motioned for David to follow her deeper into the cave. "We'll rest here for the night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, setting his pack down and glancing around. The cave was small, but it offered shelter from the cold. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As they settled in, Zelara sat near the entrance, her eyes focused on the darkness outside. "We're getting closer," she said, her tone determined. David looked at her, a sense of purpose filling him. "We will find her," he said, his voice firm. Zelara didn't respond, but the look in her eyes told him she was thinking the same thing. They both knew the path ahead would not be easy. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The cave was quiet, the only sounds the distant howling wind and their steady breaths. As they sat in the silence, David couldn't help but think about the figure they had encountered. Who were they? And what had they meant by their cryptic warning? But those thoughts would have to wait. For now, they had to focus on the task ahead, finding Zelara's past, her purpose, and whatever awaited them in the heart of this unknown land. David knew it wouldn't be easy, but with Zelara by his side, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.